Okay, it's all yours.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Anyhow, thanks a lot to Ken for organizing this series again. And I have to apologize. I haven't been to the last meetings because everything was too busy. But I actually saw all recordings, so I'm kind of up to date with the current discussion, so to say. Okay. My topic today is: do humans process also qualitative information? And of course, this is very much related to the previous talks I gave in this series. But now I'm kind of turning my focus to some new aspects. Okay. Um, yeah, as you are surely aware of, AI is currently a big topic, and AI is very much related to this idea about how human thinking works, and that's also the topic I'm kind of working myself into over the last years. What we find is that the way we currently construct AI in this current wave of AI, which is called subsymbolic or deep neural network based or subsymbolic, runs into all sorts of problems. So we are not so sure anymore that this is really the way to generate artificial intelligence. And now people try to conceptualize this, so kind of make up some ideas of why this is actually not working out. And one theory is that these models do not have proper world models, so no real idea about how the world is actually structured. And now people think about how to build such models into AI. But this is, of course, what we already had in the past, because the so-called classic or symbolic AI had exactly this. So they had world models, explicitly programmed world models, and they run into all sorts of problems with this because these world models are they are very quickly spiraling out of control. So to generate them and to update them, and so it's the complexity is simply exploding very, very quickly. And now, if you want to have really some kind of combined approaches, some people call this neuro AI or something, so where you have a deep neural network at the bottom, and then on top of this, some kind of symbolic AI, then of course you have both problems in some sense of both systems. And additionally, you have to somehow interface them. And although this works in some kind of special cases, so if you develop this for some specific task or something, it's very unclear how this should work in general, because at this point you are kind of changing from some symbolic level to another one. So from kind of some representation in vectors, and now you want to have objects, for instance, and it's you can always develop a model which does exactly this, but it's not clear how a human brain would do this in general. So it's still a very, very interesting question also in AI research, how humans generate symbol systems, layers of symbol systems, and then from this, so to say, world models. And I think if you look into into the literature, I think it's fair to say that we actually don't know how human brains or minds do this. What I find very interesting is that this actually points to a lot of philosophical questions, which people discuss really for centuries already. And one is, what is abstraction? So what is actually this movement from lower simple systems to higher simple systems? And are there proper abstract objects? So if we move from one simple system to the other, are we now getting in touch with some pre-existing object? Like, for instance, we could speculate in the case of numbers, that we kind of not make up numbers, but that we actually discover numbers in some sense. So these are very interesting questions. And unfortunately, they are also quite unclear what we think how these objects or what these objects are. But anyhow, AI research and development is only one way of how we might arrive at this insight that there's something very real about these abstract objects. So it's not totally up to our choice what numbers are and all these things. And what we find is, as I said, that many of the problems we run into now in artificial intelligence are actually very, very old problems with this. In my past talks in this series, I try to dig into these problems, and you might remember some of them because they are all, in my opinion, somehow related to this problem of abstraction and abstract objects. And I talked about the simple grounding problem, framing problem, hard problem, the problem of abstractions of universals. Because in all these cases, you have this idea that somehow what we as humans are thinking about is not just kind of vector relations or some relational definition of something, but that we really kind of experience some quality or have some insight into some idea or similar. So this is, of course, also very hard to conceptualize, but this is why I believe that these problems are, if you look into the detail, and some of my last talks more about this, are related. One thing I found very, very helpful, if you want to talk about this, is a distinction which is made in the philosophy of information. And this is unfortunately a distinction which is usually not going very well with scientists. So they make a distinction which they call quantitative versus qualitative information. And quantitative information is then physically implemented information relationally defined in the sense in which we usually talk about information, but they say there's a different sort of information. And that's actually what we usually call meaning, and which is much more common in the humanities. And so some people say, okay, so actually there is no qualitative information. But the whole thing I'm talking about is the assumption that there might be something like qualitative information. And this is why I have this question in the title of my talk. Are we or are humans actually able to compute or process qualitative information? So then we would have a brain which does quantitative information, but somehow that would be related to a mind which actually processes qualitative information. So we would really process, for instance, red as a color or something. If you look into the philosophy of information, the relation between the two is unclear again. So there are models how they might be related, and but overall it's quite unclear. And you can imagine it like this. Whenever you implement something or have something in your neural network or similar, it could always be something different. So for instance, you would say, okay, so this neural network structure now corresponds to the color of red or something. Then it's still just the relational, so to say, position of certain implementation of physical values or something. And you can always imagine that this just by chance stands for something completely different, like for instance, some kind of a tube system in some big city in Africa or something. Huh? So there's no unique relationship between these physically implemented relational parts and something like a quality, like a color. So that's the basic problem which you have when you want to put one on the other. Huh? The other way around, you could say that basically every physical system makes every computation you could imagine. Huh? You just have to look at it the right way. So imagine you have some gas in some container, and just by picking, so to say, the right framing, you could always say, oh, this part actually makes this computation. And then again, this computation is not uniquely related to any meaning or content which we process as humans. So that's the problem which people want to discuss with this distinction of quantitative and qualitative information. Okay, so now if we look at AI, then actually both sub-symbolic AI, so deep neural network AI, as well as symbolic AI, so classic AI, both just compute quantitative information because, so to say, they never experience red in some sense, but they either have some kind of label, which is just red. For instance, the symbolic thing, I can just program into the system that's red, and now I can functionally define what red is. But also in the sub-symbolic system, red is just kind of the relation between certain vectors which I have implemented into the system. Huh? So they both have only a relational definition of red, which is optimized, so to say, with respect to some kind of beginning and end interface, which is usually some human which sits in front of it and says yes or no. And they do not really process the actual qualitative information within these symbols. But humans, on the other hand, seem to, at the lower level in our brains, seem to work like deep neural networks. So there, I think it's totally clear, and that's a fact which we also have to take into account. We do this kind of quantitative information processing, like if we think about motor sensory actions or something, that's surely working like this. If you have a reflex or something, it's hot and you take your hand back or something. That's I think very well imaginably, you can very well imagine that this works like quantitative information processing. But then on some higher level, humans seem to be able to make this jump to some kind of different abstraction layer where we now have numbers, where we have colors, where we have ideas and these things. And the question really is how to get this into one model. So of course, you can always say, no, that's just an illusion. So there's this phenomenological experience of red, that's just an illusion. And the university of numbers, that's not really universal. It's just kind of, we define this. I think this project is definitely worth doing, so to say. And people are, of course, pushing this forward, like finding out whether it can be described in this way. But that's just not, so to say, what I want to try here. So here, the idea is really, if we can really process qualitative information, what would this mean for science and the other things? So that's the basic question. Yeah, and then you run into this problem that if you say, okay, so we're humans, we are proper subjects and we have proper phenomenological experience. How do we want to put this into words? How do we want to put this into kind of a model where we describe what's going on? And there's this very nice quote by Gödel: "The basis of everything is meaningful predication." Husserl had this. Hegel did not have this. That is why his philosophy lacks clarity. The problem is, if you want to assume that humans process qualitative information, and you want to develop a model which allows for this, then you have to admit that there are certain elements which stand for these things which you want to describe. So if you want to have a phenomenological experience of the color red, then you cannot at the same point deny that there's a existing property red, of which we then experience. Because if you do that, then you fall back to classical idealism, or also a lot of idealistic models which are out there, where you can then not make kind of proper statements about what's interacting with what to actually give this. Then you end up with a totally unstructured mind in a sense. And this is, I think, something which we unfortunately find very, very often if people try to have dualist models or dual aspect models or something. So you basically want to stick to your material properties. You don't want to allow any other properties. But then if you want to have some kind of mind, it cannot be a proper mind. It can only be like an inside of some thing which happens, or it can be some kind of fluffy thing, like a cloud over your actual material processes. If you want to end up with any kind of model which explains you anything about the interaction of something which might be a mind and something which might be a brain or something, then you have to at some point make some ontological commitment and say, okay, so that's a property, because then you can start to talk about how might a mind be structured so that it can interact with a brain, for which we also assume that it is structured by physical properties. Yeah. But if you say this, so if you want to go there and say, okay, so let's be it. We have physical properties and now we have non-physical property, and that's called red, and it kind of can interact with our brains. The problem then, of course, is that you basically have already arrived at the existence of abstract objects, because you allow now for non-physical properties to exist. And if you, for instance, then would combine the non-physical properties of red and square, then you would have the idea of a red square, and that's already an abstract object. So if you want to go down that road, you basically assume that there are abstract entities like numbers, like other things we could think about in our mind. So of course, this red square, which I think of, is not a proper red square because it's missing physical properties, but it's still kind of a proper existing entity which I can somehow relate to. Huh? So yeah, so that's the suggestion I want to make. Of course, you don't have to follow it. So you can think about, can we do this in any other way? Can we allow for phenomenological experiences, but do not accept that there are non-physical properties? And I think that is not possible, but that's probably something to discuss afterwards. Okay, so there are basically two solutions to this problem of abstract objects, and one is in philosophy called human supervenience, that this is actually something which is completely determined by the underlying material structure. And then abstract objects are actually not the thing where I want to go to, so to say, but are just patterns in concrete objects. So you have all these proper material objects, and then you say an abstract object is just a pattern which I find in these objects, and it's just kind of a concept which I develop from seeing all these objects and seeing all these patterns, and then I say, oh, there's a pattern, and that pattern is called giraffe, and of course it has certain similarities with all giraffes, but it's not an essence which these giraffes share in some sense. Huh? And this, of course, connects very nicely to AI research. So this is what we believe, how we have to push this forward. It connects to common theories of consciousness. So where people have like these ideas of global workspace theory or something that also goes into the same direction. It corresponds to connectionist neuroscience. So if you really believe that the brain is working like some complex neural network. And it, of course, very nicely connects to physicalism and materialism. And overall, I would call this a deflated view of human thought. So the point is not that I say it's not possible to do this, but I think it's something we anyhow kind of investigate very much. So I find this less interesting to go there. But this is an important research project, and we should see how far we can get. I personally don't see how we can solve the philosophical problems we have, the human thought, but it's an open problem. Yeah, my question especially is how would this be implemented in human thinking? So if you say, okay, so it's just in pattern, then this is kind of a very nice definition if you look on top on humans and on objects, and then you say, oh, say these abstract objects, that's just kind of a pattern. But these patterns then themselves would have to be implemented in neural networks. And that's the thing which is so hard, as we now find out, to implement in AI. So it's not clear how to arrive at stable symbols in deep neural networks, especially if they are continual learning, because we run into all these problems that this only works in low dimensions, that we have problems with catastrophic forgetting, so they learn something and it's very easy to unlearn again. And so while we believe that normally, yes, there must be a way that this must be true, if we actually want to do it with brains, it's getting extremely complicated. It's not successful. So that's the important message. So it's not a done project, so that we don't have to investigate any alternatives anymore. Yeah, so it doesn't seem to work out perfectly well, and also we run into all these old problems. So what are numbers? Why are they universal? And what about color and all these things? So this is the problem with this. The alternative would, of course, be to go back to models which are very, very old, actually, but which seem very strange to us. Huh? So when we really say, okay, abstract objects are just real, they're just a thing, so to say, and they are a bundle of universal qualitative properties, and these properties carry the meaning, like red or the number 1 or something. And this meaning is not relationally defined, so not functionally defined, but it's really something which we sort of say grasp by experiencing this property, like we get the meaning of red by actually seeing the color red. But the issue then, of course, is that our higher level human thought would actually be somehow in exchange with these abstract objects. Our mind would then be something, so we would have some kind of continuous gradual development from a brain into a mind. But these upper parts of our combined mind brain would be actually also something like an abstract object. And then the question, of course, would be, can this work out scientifically at all? Can we think about any scientific theories which would kind of support the idea that we are actually processing abstract object in the sense of qualitative information? And this is I will be jumping over this slide. That's probably not so interesting here. This is what I was working on over the last years, to think about whether we can have a model like Plato or Leibniz or Gödel and still arrive at the scientific theories which we have today. And this was the so-called emanation problem. So how do you come from the idea from that you have an idealistic setup where you have all sorts of properties, not only physical but also non-physical properties? How do you arrive then at a material world and material causation and all these things? And in this book, I do not set up one model only, but I kind of discuss the problems which you encounter when you want to set up the model. But the interesting trick, in a sense, is that usually we try to project from downstairs to upstairs. So we have experiences. From this, we conclude that physics is correct. And then we have to extrapolate from physics up. So it's very hard to describe then why they are subjects and then why they are qualities, because at the bottom level, we already say that they are not included elements. In these idealistic models, of course, it's the other way around. We can safely assume that we have subjects and qualities, but now we have to extrapolate down, so to say, and explain why is there material causality, why do we have a material world, and all this. But the trick, in a sense, is that this just means that we have to reinterpret or give a new interpretation of our physical theories. And this is, of course, a field where we are very good at, because we do this all the time. We try to go from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics. We go from quantum mechanics to string theory. And now we would go, so to say, from quantum mechanics to a model which is based on universal properties in a sense. So that's a little bit the trick of the idea. And I think I can somehow show that this is indeed possible. So it's not completely impossible to set up a model which can work. And what you end up with is then some form of monadic idealism, so very close to Leibniz actually, but updated for modern science. And the basic feature is really that everything is made up of universal qualitative properties, and the difference between the material world and abstract objects is just that these physical properties are differently handled than the other ones. Yeah, there's some defense game to this, so you have to show that this actually really attaches to the underlying mathematical theories. And then there's, of course, an offense game to this, because that's, at this point, of course, just a nice theory, just a nice story in a sense. And without any empirical evidence, there's absolutely no need to switch to that new theory. And so it only becomes interesting if now, from this model, you can derive consequences necessary consequences, which then lead to new experiments. And this is, so to say, I make some suggestions in the book, but this is, so to say, in a sense where I'm now. And today I want to present you one idea of where this could be going. The important part, what I find very important about this is not an idealism where I kind of make some logical deliberations and then I say, okay, so the world has to be idealistic and these things. It's really the other way around. It's just like a scientific hypothesis. So I say, okay, so normally we assume there are certain properties and this should explain something, and then I develop a scientific theory, I derive some consequences, I want to go to experiment, and it's the same here. I just make a scientific hypothesis that there might be more than the currently assumed properties, and then you come to consequences, and then you come hopefully also to experiments. And if they turn out to be wrong, then, so to say, the model is just it's just wrong. Okay, so yeah, you can think about from the setup about some consequences which you would expect, and a few are very much in line with what we already know. In such a model, you can't have classical mechanics at the bottom, because at the very bottom, objects behave really also like abstract objects, so very quantum-like in a sense. And also you have to have something like relativity, because otherwise these objects don't preserve identity, and I will not go into this too much. Then you can think about, okay, so if humans now can handle these properties, that's actually quite cool. So what maybe they can do something which you can show, which is not possible with if they only have a brain. And then you can think about in biological organization, it might be quite an advantage that you can at some point attach to these non-physical properties like red. So for instance, if you think about color consistency or something, you would have something like a feedback marker, which is totally stable in its quality. So you have some noisy signal, and then you attach some marker to this, which is totally stable with respect to its quality. And then, so to say, in evolution, you could slowly build in more of these markers, which kind of serve as a feedback a goal for some kind of for making certain like cell development or something stable. So you could think about this one, but this is very quickly becoming extremely complex because we currently know so little about how actually the stability of cells or gene reproduction works. So it's very hard to think about any convincing experiments, because it's anyhow such an interesting and open topic. So the example I want to present here is about information processing cut short. So I want to make the point that if we attach to, or if at some point evolution has incorporated such non-physical properties, then that should be actually have been an advantage. And then we come to the fact that if this is possible, that should also be seen in structures. And I hope I will be able to make this clear why we should then also see this in the brain. So the brain then suddenly has a lot more possibilities to, so to say, to store certain information, to coordinate certain activity and things like this. Okay, so I will only look into one thing here, and this is the question or the idea that if humans process qualitative information, then this should be connected to an evolutionary advantage over the normal way of computing things. And also this advantage should have been accessible early on. So it's not enough that afterwards we can say, yes, obviously, mathematics is extremely powerful, but mathematics is very likely not the reason why early organisms would have attached to anything like qualia or something. They would not have incorporated properties like red or something, because they already know that afterwards it would be good to have mathematics available or something. So the question basically is, what would be the evolutionary purpose of qualia? And qualia are understood here as basically one property abstract objects. So red is, so to say, one property which already is the beginning of an abstract object, which might be a red triangle, which I have in my mind. And then to answer this question, we of course have to be kind of clear about what we believe is special about qualitative information. So what could be an advantage that qualitative information has over quantitative information? And of course, the question of what this is kind of part of this problem. So it's basically open to discussion, and we have to think about this. And my working hypothesis is that really it works like qualia, basically. It's transparently given. It's not relationally defined. It works via some kind of semantic logic. So there's some connection between these different impressions which I have, for instance, colors. And as a concept, so to say, that basically means that there's some form of Platonic realism. And then I can very nicely use existing word by just saying, okay, so then maybe what is special about qualitative information, so what is special about qualia is that which is also special about abstract objects. And there's, of course, a lot of work existing on abstract objects in philosophy, especially object theory by Edward Salter. And his theory is agnostic concerning the question of whether it's just a pattern or whether they are real Platonic abstract objects. But here, if we now want to use his object theory for formulating things, then we would read it in a very strong Platonic interpretation. So these things really objectively exist in our world. And now I will give you one hypothesis which you might form then in this idea of this research project, so to say. You could say the ability to process qualitative information allows humans to avoid the problems of classical AI and combined approaches with generating and handling complex world models. So you might remember the beginning. I said that the problem with current deep neural network AI is that they do not have world models. They don't know what's right or wrong. They do not even have an assumption about what's right or wrong. And the idea is to add now world models on top of these deep neural networks. But this is very complicated. We tried this in the past. It's very hard to handle complicated world models. And so the hypothesis here is that this is a reason, evolutionary reason, why it was a good idea to incorporate qualia into kind of purely material structures initially. And then we can ask, okay, so what would be an advantage of abstract objects in a world model? And the first part is that they're universal. So all these properties are universal. So whenever you have some entity in your world model, it only exists once. Automatically, you don't have to do anything. Just by setting up the thing, if you set up a red triangle in your world model, it's a universal red triangle. It's just one red triangle. So you always generate automatically objects from classes, and all existing relations to this entity are automatically imported. That's interesting because people with classical world models have always this problem of background knowledge, and all this background knowledge would be automatically imported in a sense. The second thing is that this information would be qualitative, and qualitative means that all possible or conceivable negations are automatically implemented. By knowing that red is red, we automatically implement, so to say, all negations what red is not. Like it's not a smell, it's not a person, it's not an animal and everything. And this does not have to be kind of put as background knowledge into any world model. And the third thing is that it's an abstract object. And an abstract object in general has the advantage that it can be incomplete. So if you have proper physical objects, then they have to have a certain set of physical properties. So they can't have a color without having a shape. So every physical object has to have a shape. But an abstract object doesn't have to have a shape. So you can think about that red thing or something, and you might have some kind of idea of a shape, but it does not kind of by definition have to have a full set of physical properties. And that makes them quite powerful because they can then behave like quantum objects. So you can have an object which covers a very large number of possible objects. And then if you know more about this object, then this object, so to say, collapses in some sense to the specific object. So your cat, for me, is some kind of superposition of all possible cats. I can reason with all possible kind of features which this your cat might have. But as soon as I really encounter this cat, so to say, my idea of cat will suddenly collapse to very specific features that your cat has, like a certain color and everything.
Let me
This is,
just
of course,
interrupt a second.
yeah.
I got a phone call from Ken that his internet had collapsed,
Oh, okay.
but we continue.
Okay. Yeah. So in a sense, that's of course just what abstract objects do. And if you would be able to implement them as pattern into some complicated neural network, then you might be able to argue that actually you would have the same features available in a very complicated neural network. But the point here, of course, is that all of this would be free of charge happening in the non-physical part of our mind-brain structure, whatever. And the point now is, if this really happens, and that's of course a big if, then brain structures should look very different, because then you would have this additional opportunity that this kind of binding, this positioning of objects in your world model would not have to be done as quantitative processing in your brain. This would just kind of automatically happen in whatever you generate on top of the qualia, which are generated by your brain in a sense. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And just to give you an idea of why this might be measurable in the sense that things could look really very different, I give you one example experiment, but it's not a proper experiment because it's just a thought experiment, and I still have no idea about how this could become a real experiment. So that's basically what I'm working on now. The probably first step of putting some object in your world model would be to recognize it as this as this object that it is. So that's kind of the first step of binding. Also, if you want to talk this think about this in neuroscience, that would be like you get all this information about red shapes or something, but at some point you have to bind it together in some object to then later on put it into some proper semantic context. And so object recognition would be some kind of very early step of getting this done. And then you can ask, okay, so how long would it take in these different options which we now have? And then you can think about, okay, so in symbolic AI, so classical AI, this would be really like a proper algorithm. You would go to lists or something, compare objects for properties and stuff like this. So that would depend on both the number of properties, small n, and the number of objects you can identify, large n. But this is, of course, a very naive algorithm. So you can, the prefactor might be actually very small if you are very clever in organizing this. Then you can go to subsymbolic AI. So talk about how deep neural networks would make this. And again, if you are very naive, then you just say, okay, so for every object I can identify, I will have an output node. And then it would scale to the just with a number of output nodes. And the number of property nodes are very likely much smaller, so they don't really count. And of course, you can shift this together. You can have floating point numbers, and then you can make it much more clever. So this is again a very naive implementation, but it will, in some sense, still depend on the number of objects to identify. And then you can ask, can we do any better than that? And then you can think about quantum computing. Of course, there's this Grover algorithm for list search. And the thing here is, so to say, that you have this whole list, but you can compare the whole list at the same time for properties. So you can say, oh, it should be brown, and then suddenly all objects which are not brown are, so to say, excluded by this oracle. But unfortunately, because it's a physical quantum state, you have to, so to say, amplify this state. So there are additional steps, and this then ends up as the square root of the number of objects in the list. And this is, of course, a big gain if you think about really large lists. It's from 1 million objects to just the square root, so just thousands of objects. So that's a big gain in computing power. But if you now think about how this would work, if it would really push qualia into some abstract object that would be our mind, then this would not look like a search. It would just look like an object setup. So you would say, this object now gets the first property, which immediately negates all other properties, negates all other objects which do not share this color. And then you would push the second property of this object to this bundle in this world map. And then it would immediately negate, again, a huge number of objects which are possible. And so by just kind of delivering this qualia into this bundle that's part of the world model, just by the object setup, it would automatically become the object which you are searching for in your world model. So that's independent of the number of objects which you are searching for, because it's basically negating all other possibilities automatically. And that would be a little bit like quantum computing without the amplification step. It's like you have this whole list and you just say, no, it has these properties, and this immediately negates everything else, like the oracle in quantum computing. But there's no need for amplification because you're not working any noisy state or something. You work on a clearly defined abstract object. Okay, so that's the idea of how such experiments would look like. Of course, now you can ask, okay, so why can't we show this or something? And one problem, of course, would be that in this model, there is some material computation initially for like getting signals to your eye, for processing all the initial steps like identification of colors, of textures or something. And only at some certain point, qualia would be generated, and then these qualia would be pushed into this abstract object, which is your mind. And of course, it's extremely hard, or we don't know how to separate these two things in a sense. So you would always have to add this process of delivering qualia to then actually manipulate qualia. And the other thing is that if you then want to compare something, you also don't know the algorithms which you compare to, because we currently don't know how abstract recognition happens in the brain. So we know a lot of details like how the initial steps work or something, but how the actual object in the end is formed is something which we actually don't know. Yeah, but this is so to say where the project is currently at, and I hope it's clear, or I hope it's clear why I think it's important to have models like this A world or model A, because only if you make some commitment to what you believe is the alternative reality which you want to prove, only then can you derive consequences and come to experiments. And this is, I think, what is very often missing in alternative theories, that you really make some commitment. Okay, then it must be looking like this, or it should be looking like this, and then let's try to derive some experiments and test them. But of course, it's very complicated and still very unclear of whether any of this can succeed. Okay, so thank you for your attention. The take-home message is basically this: if Platonic abstract objects exist, and if humans can process them, then this is just so useful, then we should be able to find experimental evidence for this at the neuroscience and psychology interface. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Okay, we're going to have questions now. Let me start with a question, though, Martin.